Good evening. This is Benjamin, and the Genesis issue has come up so many times, and it appears to be something that people are really seriously disturbed by. It seems like some people, just are overwhelmed by it. I, for one, I've been a Christian since I was 13, and it never really bothered me that much, but I guess I never really thought about it that much. And when I did, I don't know, I guess I kind of took the time to not jump to conclusions, and I'm afraid that's what people do with this question. The question is, does the natural history given by science disagree with Genesis 1? It's a question that some people are defined by and some people just avoid. I mean, I've seen some people say that it's not important. I've seen some people say on the basis of that they refuse to believe the Bible at all. But just natural history given by science, just to explain that term, all that means is the story of history, before the written records where people were writing down what they saw happen. So in other words, the general history that we have before that, what we know from like scientific findings and research and studies in so many broad areas of science. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's Genesis 1, which claims to be a history, and people say, well, this history is so different from what science tells us that, we have to throw Genesis out. And some people will say, well, we will throw science out, and that kind of thing. So if you've noticed in the video, Genesis is misinterpreted. That's what I'm going to be arguing for, that Genesis is generally misinterpreted and that we need to interpret it right. Now, Genesis is an ancient book. It's very, very old. No matter what you want to say about who wrote it and when, you have to admit it's old. It's very old. The problem with understanding Genesis in any ancient book is that they don't answer our questions. And this is an important point. I want you to understand this point. If you read a letter that was written to someone else who has different things going on in their life, you're probably going to find that it doesn't deal with your stuff very well at all. Okay? So if I say something to someone else and you overhear it and you think I'm saying it to you, or you treat it as though it's being said to you even though you know it's not, then you're going to think, I don't know anything about you and I don't deal with your stuff very well. And we tend to do that with Genesis. We know it's not written to us, but we treat it like it's supposed to be. And that's an important point. The Bible was not written to us. And I know that a lot of Christians, I can hear you screaming out there, oh, the Bible wasn't written to me. God wrote the Bible, it's to me, it's to us. And no, it's not. You look at you open up the book of Romans, what does it say to those who at the church at Rome? Okay, that's not necessarily you. I mean, it may be, but probably not. And that's not everybody, and that's the point. The Christian doctrine of interpretation, of biblical inspiration, is not that it was written directly to you, but rather that through what human authors wrote, God moved through that, so that God oversaw that it was for you, even though it's not to you. And the difficulty is, if you misunderstand that, it can create huge problems. It seems so simple, but we'll see an example here of how that can create huge problems. And so, since we're saying Genesis is misinterpreted, I do want to point out that there are rules for proper interpretation. We're not saying that you just interpret it however you want. I'm saying that what people think is a literal interpretation is not literal, and it's not obeying the rules of interpretation. Yeah, okay. You may find that Genesis does a terrible job at answering your question, but then do you have any idea what the right questions are? In other words, what are the questions it's trying to answer? It doesn't say what they are. And this is where we jump into the problems. What are the right questions? We're going to find that out as we look into the text. And I will be using the NIV, New International Version, to read from. and I want to make this point real quick, humans translate the Bible. The translations are not God-inspired. So I don't think the translations are God-inspired. I think you need to try to find a good translation in your language. And the best version to go by is the original and remove the need for a translator. But I don't know about you, I don't exactly have that ability. And most translators will even go to other ones for help sometimes. So it's a peer-reviewed thing. Alright, now, verse 1 of Genesis 1, the first verse of the Bible, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And verse 2 says, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Genesis is not trying to explain how God made everything. Make that point abundantly clear. Genesis is not here to tell you how God made everything. That is the question we approach the text with. How did God make everything? Well, go read Genesis and it'll tell you how He did. Nope. Genesis doesn't try to answer that question. And if you try to answer that question with Genesis, you will misinterpret and get a non-literal interpretation of Genesis. It is not trying to tell you how God made everything. Not at all. Genesis is making statements about how God made the things people worshipped as gods. See, something huge has been said in the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is a summary for the rest of the chapter that was dramatic, weird, and world-changing back then. But to us, it's like, yeah, duh, that's what the Bible says. God made everything. I once knew a kid, and he said he'd been to church for years, and I said, well, what'd you learn there? And he said, God made the world and stuff. That's all he knew. He didn't know anything else. And that's what a lot of people, know. That's all they know. God made everything. They don't know anything else. But they know that. Back then, people didn't know that. Back then, everyone believed in everybody's God everywhere. And there were tons and tons of God. And if you found about a new God, you hoped to be rich enough to have a statue to Him in your home, or at least in your town, where you could go pay homage to Him so that you wouldn't have to be afraid of that God. And they believed that there was always some sort of existence, reality, and always some sort of gods that dwelled in it and had their power. And the belief was that those gods started out more chaotic and slowly evolved to become sort of like higher life forms, smarter, better. And that was consistent in all the, you look at the Greek, it started out with crazier and crazier. You get to the time of the Titans, and then eventually the gods that existed, what Greeks thought were the current gods, were much smarter. And the same thing with the Babylonian gods. It starts out with like the first chaos god and the mythos god, and then eventually it gets to the wisdom god. Now, so the point we have to make is that Genesis is, what it's doing is it's saying, this thing you think is a god, God made that. So it does go through and say, God made this, and God made that, and God made this, and God made that. But it's not trying to tell you how God made everything. It's trying to tell you how God made the things that you think are gods. If you lived back then, you would think that, or at least you would be familiar with people thinking that. Alright? Okay, the perspective is from earth. In other words, it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So that's their statement of like all of the cosmos. I guess you could say the Greeks would say cosmos, but the Hebrews said the heavens and the earth. And so in other words, God's made the heavens and the earth, and it says, verse 2, now the earth was formless and empty. Okay? So it's talking about earth. In other words, all the rest of the universe has already been made, and now we're to the point of the earth and how the things that they worshipped as gods are getting made by God. So it's not going to say how the earth was made. It's just going to say how the things they worshipped as gods were made by God. It doesn't even say how God made those things. It just mentions the gods. In other words, this thing goes down the list of Babylonian gods that people believed in back then, and it just knocks them right off. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. This thing, the next God made that. Okay? Next God made that. Next God made that. Alright, and it's important to understand that, the next point. People worshipped a primordial chaos god. We talked about this a little bit. They would have been familiar with the Babylonian name for it, Marduk. Okay, and what Genesis does is it goes straight for that. It says, the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Strange terminology used there. We say the earth wasn't water. That's just a difficulty in translation because strange terminology is being used. Terminology that the Hebrews didn't normally use. And the reason strange terminology is being used is because the Hebrew language is trying to make puns. And you say, well, why are they making puns? Well, we'll get into that a little more. Yeah, so Genesis used puns because almost no one knew how to read. So the point is that a pun is easy to remember by ear. And this was a radical idea that these gods were made by the one God. So Genesis 1 is written in sort of a pun form. So people could remember it because most people didn't know how to read. Most people didn't have paper or writing skills or time for that kind of thing. And so you can remember puns, things like, you know, you can tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. Like, you can remember that from sound. In Hebrew language did that, especially with this chapter, to help people remember it, to help make the point, help spread the idea to as many people as possible. And the other point I want to make is that this agrees with science. This idea that, you know, all of the heavens and the earth was made, and then the earth was first made, it was formless and empty, and, you know, yeah, that's what science tells us, is that a bunch of rocks came together and it was a chaotic, lava-flowing mess. Okay? And it was just craziness. And it was just formless, and there was no form to it. It was just, you know, that kind of thing. Alright? Now, we'll go to verse 3. It says, and God said, let there be light. We will go through these a little faster as we go. Okay, God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Alright, this is not the creation of light itself, but rather what they worshipped as the light that lit the earth. In other words, this is not saying this is when God made the light itself. This is saying, next God made the thing you believe is a God, the light that lights the earth with its day-night cycle. That was heavily worshipped back then. You know, the idea in the Greek mythology of like a sun god going through the sky and then taking a break for a while, and that's night. And it was the same way in the Babylonian mythology, this idea of the light that lights the earth. Okay? This was something they worshipped back then, and it's not the creation of light itself, but rather the lighting of the earth that they worshipped. Okay? This would have been so obvious to the people that it didn't need much explanation. In other words, you don't know anyone who believes in those gods today. And to us, what's obvious and normal is the Genesis story, and then maybe beyond that, people who don't believe in God at all. But back then, what was obvious and normal was the multiple gods that everyone believed in. And the Genesis story was weird. And much less the idea of no God, that was unheard of. Okay? So, we get a little confused because it doesn't take the time to say, I'm talking about this, and remember this, because everyone knew about that then. It was, you know, common knowledge, but it's not common knowledge to us. And that kind of creates that problem where we don't speak Hebrew and we don't know that stuff. And the next point is this fits with science. Once the earth would have formed, got rotating, and that kind of thing, there would have been the lighting of the earth that they understood, a day-night cycle. Alright, it says in verse 6, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. Again, strange terminology because of the puns. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered the waters, and the gathered waters He called seas. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so people had sky gods, people had land gods, people had sea gods. You know, we're familiar with this if you know much about mythology. That's all typical mythological stuff. And he's saying here, okay, the point is not that, what he's doing is he's saying, next God made this, next God made this, next God made this, next God made this. And it fits with science, because he did make that stuff next. But it doesn't necessarily include, it's not really a scientific book in the sense that it's not trying to tell you the whole scientific picture. But it's telling you, it's going to the, what it does is it takes a list of gods people worship back then, and it says, next God made that one, next God made that one, next God made that one. So it's trying to introduce the idea of one God making everything by telling a story about an order of events of him making them. And we read that story about an order of events and think that he's trying to tell us just how he made everything. But he's not trying to tell us how he made everything. He's trying to tell us how those gods were made. Okay? But he tells it in an order of next this happened and next this happened, you know, or maybe not next, but after that, then that, after that, then that. And you'll see what I mean when we get to the next one. But the point is here, this fits with science. Once the volcanic activity would have subsided in the early Earth, the sun and moon would have become... wait, no, we're skipping. This is where the sky and the land and the sea. And that would have happened next. Water forming on the Earth. The oceans and that kind of thing, and land and sky in a water cycle, that would have happened next according to science. Okay, we get to verse 11. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. This verse is key, okay, for a lot of reasons. We're just going to go through it, okay, what these verses is. People think that this verse is the unscientific idea, or it just represents a general unscientific idea from just primitive people. They say, this is dumb. They say, life first formed in the sea, and it was microbial. And they say, well, it just makes sense that these Bronze Age primitive people wouldn't have known anything about that. And they say this verse proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that this book was not made by God who knew everything, but that it was written by some people who were guessing at what they knew best. And the problem is that we're not understanding those primitive people very well at all. Genesis skips things because it isn't answering our questions. We've approached this text with a question of, this is how God made everything. And if you do that, then you say, well, next God made that. And you say, well, what about the first life forms? God skipped them? No. God, it's not mixing up the order. It's not claiming that plants were the first life forms, or much less land plants. That's not the claim here. It's claiming the next thing on their list of gods that God, the one God made, was plants. So it's saying, you look at the scientific story, the next thing that was really made was plants. And he's saying that was the next thing on their list of gods. So he's saying, God made that one next. Okay? Not right next. But they didn't worship invisible microbial life, so he's not going to cover that. It's not that he doesn't know about that, but it's more that he's just not going to cover that, because it wasn't part of the purpose of the book. Okay? To teach them things about science. We have no idea what the questions it is answering, largely because we live today and we read English. And these issues of ancient gods aren't our issues, and we don't know about those gods, and we don't. It's not even Hebrew. Genesis is trying to explain when the plants when God made the plants, but only to introduce that the one God made them, and that's not a big deal to us. So we missed that completely, but it was a huge deal to them. And importantly, plants. One of the reasons plants were worshipped is because humans had discovered farming. So plants were worshipped because plants were the basis of food You know, I heard a story about some guys who went hunting the other day, and they said it was so great, all the food we had, and it's like they didn't hunt for any of it. Our farmer provided everything they ate. They might have killed one animal the whole week, but they ate well, right? Because they had farming. And that's what this verse is talking about. You can take the seeds from a plant them, and voila, you get more of that plant. And that is what this verse is making the point. The God they worship, the gods of farming and agriculture, and the ability to do that, to plant seeds and get more of a crop, more of food, more of that, you know, planting. He says, next God made that. It doesn't mean next God made plants so much as plants in their sense of the word. So, okay. It's not saying that, you know, plants can't change in form or didn't evolve. It's saying the farming was brought in their sense of that, you know, the ability to do that. And farming is a huge thing for them, but it's not a huge thing for us. We take it for granted. People don't even realize, like, everything they eat, you know, unless it was caught as a fish, it was probably farmed. Okay. They realized it then. Everyone was a farmer back then. Okay, and this also fits science. As we said before, the next thing on their list of gods would have been plants. And after God, you know, made the seas and the sky, and then, you know, you skip down to plants. Plants, you know, would have been next in the right order. They skipped a lot of stuff, but it's to the next God on the list. Okay, verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. Alright, this is not about the creation of the sun and moon itself, but rather what the people back then worshipped. The sun and moon gods that they looked up to and worshipped, the lights in the sky, the stars, lights in the sky. What they worship would have formed next, because they worship lights in the sky, and the sky would have been radically altered by the formation of plants on land and the changing, you know, oxygen level of the atmosphere. And probably, who knows, maybe they couldn't even see the stars, and the sun wouldn't have really looked the way it does, and neither would the moon, until plants on land formed. And so that's what they worshipped. You know, and sun gods, moon gods, star gods, these things were common. And he's trying to make a point. The writer of this text is trying to make a point. Next, God made that. Okay. And this also fits science. That would have happened next, scientifically speaking, in the sense that they worship them. Their gods would have been made next. Not the sun itself, because they didn't worship the sun itself. They didn't have a concept of the sun itself. But their God was a light in the sky. The light in the sky would have been made when the cloud cover changed and when the atmosphere changed. But the sun itself, as we understand it, was not something they worshipped. Okay? Notice the strange terminology, things like the lesser light and the greater light. These were part of the puns that they used. Okay. It says, and God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. Here, many find fault with Genesis's order of creation on both things that get created. They say, water life would have evolved before plants on land, and the sun and moon in between the two. It's ridiculous. Now we've covered everything up to here, but we'll go to the water life first, and then, you know, people say, well, what about dinosaurs? You know, they're supposed to be land animals before, you know, bird. And people say this doesn't make any sense. Okay, a translational issue arises here. Translation can be hard work. If any of you know things about other languages and translating from one to another, it can be very difficult. Because many times there's no one word that means the same thing from one language to another. If it's a couple words in one language and it's one word in another. And this is especially true with the Bible, because people say if you bring in extra words, you're corrupting. It's not a good translation because you're putting too much of your own idea into it. And then if there's multiple words in the Bible, but we have one word for that in English, they say, well, you're taking stuff out of the Bible, and they don't like that either. Okay, so living creatures, it says let the water teem with living creatures. Living creatures is nephesh. It means more literally animals with the breath of life in them that can form relationships with humans. What does that mean? Sea mammals. Sea mammals. We've skipped a whole bunch of stuff. But what was worshipped as gods? Not dinosaurs. People didn't even know about dinosaurs. What do they worship? Whales. Dolphins. I mean, look at the legends about dolphins and creatures of the sea and whales and those kinds of things that they saw as ruling the sea. Birds too. Birds too. Do they worship birds? The eagle and that kind of thing? Yeah. Okay. So this also fits with science. These birds and sea mammals like this would have come next. We've skipped a lot. You know, we skipped the first life forms. We skipped all the way to plants. And then we got to, you know, the sun and moon, as, you know, the oxygen changing in the atmosphere. And then we skipped over most of the history of life on Earth to a very late stage, but we skipped to the animals that the people worshipped back then, which would have still been alive back then. Mighty sea creatures. Okay, and birds. Alright, and verse 24, and God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Here, many people find fault with the order of events because of the scientific understanding about the first land animals. People think the first animal that crawled onto the sea, then dinosaurs, then whales, then birds, or something close to that. And they say, this makes no sense. Land animals would have existed long before that stuff. And translational issue again, I hate to say it, but this only refers to 3 different types of land animals that were worshipped as gods. Wild animals is the best translation we have for chaya, which usually referred to carnivorous animals. You know, a pack of wolves, you know, the wolf, the jackal, the bear, the lion, the tiger, that kind of thing. They were worshipped. The word for livestock, behemoth, cows and that kind of thing, still worshipped. It's really more cows. Still worshipped today in different cultures. You know, in India is the first one that pops to mind. But in their day, you know, with Moses and the golden calf, for sure worshipped. Animals that creep on the ground was their way of saying rodents. And the interesting thing is they didn't have one word like we have rodent. They had animals that creep on the ground. And we have the word rodent. But they worshipped them. And so the animal that they knew then would have come next, later. In other words, the age of mammals and all that, it finally got down to the mammals that existed during their time then. Okay? The ones they worshipped. Genesis is leaving out some land animals. It is never claiming to list all the land animals. Okay? It's not trying to list them all. It's never claiming to do that. It's leaving out plenty. That would be a ginormous book. Even back then, they knew about a lot of animals. They lived outside all the time, you know. This also fits with science. In other words, this verse and the order of events here fits with how things, you know, we know they would have happened scientifically. All right. Next we have man, right? And next man gets made. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw that all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Interesting here Genesis breaks with the Babylonian creation story that has been sticking fairly close to. In the Babylonian creation story, man comes last because he's least important. Here, man comes last because God took time to start out with a chaotic earth, slowly bring more order to it, and then he puts man over it as sort of, you run my earth and take care of it for me. And the truth be told, man doesn't always take care of the earth just right. In fact, man has a lot of things God told man to do that man doesn't always do just right. And many see Genesis as an immediate reason to throw the Bible in the trash. And after hearing what I've said, if you've taken time to listen to it, I hope you will give the Bible some credit, maybe, and kind of the benefit of a doubt, because you'll be surprised if you take the time to investigate it a little bit instead of just waving the magic wand of disbelief over it. Maybe it's worth listening to on some other important issues. And we've talked about the idea of origin, how things got to be here. Well, if the Bible's not so terrible on that, then maybe it's not so terrible on the meaning and why people are here, and how we should live, and where we're going to spend eternity. You know, the Bible has some pretty striking stuff to say about that too. And I haven't even remotely started in all the issues that people raise, but I'll try to deal with some here. The other issue that often comes up is the amount of time which passes in Genesis. Genesis does not date the universe at 6,000 years old. That's preposterous. The entire chapter is from the perspective of the earth. In other words, 13.7 billion year old universe. Genesis is not saying that 6,000 years. It says the rest of the universe, then the earth. Okay? And then even the earth, it doesn't say that, you know, it's not 5 billion years old. Genesis is not saying that it's not 5 billion years old. The word day need not be taken literally in English or Hebrew. In English we say back in the day. You know, that kind of thing. Back in the day of horse and buggy, we just say back in the day. Remember back in the day? In Hebrew it was the same way. Evidence for how to interpret it must come from the text itself. And if you look at Genesis 2:4, it refers to the rest of all the 6 days from the previous chapter as one day. The idea that Genesis days are to be taken literally was not a standard interpretation for the most of the time people have been interpreting Genesis. I hope, and that's the important point, it hasn't been the standard interpretation for like forever. A lot of your famous Bible teachers over the centuries didn't interpret it that way. I hope this makes sense. I hope this helps. I hope you'll give the Bible a chance. I hope you'll go read it, maybe on some of those other issues, like where we're going to spend eternity, and how we should live our life, and how we maybe have messed up in life, and how we need a Savior. Thank you so much. Good evening.